G'day, my name's Simon Breheny. I'm Director of Policy at the Institute of Public Affairs. I've got Daniel Wild on the phone with me. Dan has just been in lockup for the last few hours looking at the detail of the 2018 budget. I've just been here at the office watching Scott Morrison deliver his second reading speech, which has just been delivered to the House of Representatives. We might get Dan's view on what the three biggest issues coming out of this budget are. Dan, can I turn to you? What are the three biggest things for you that have come out of the 2018 budget?
Well, the three key things here are debt, tax and spending, all of which are at record levels in this budget. So when we look at debt, it's going to reach a record $560 billion over the next financial year, which means that total gross government debt will have grown by some 380% over the last decade alone. And the reason why this is such a big issue is because every last dollar of that debt is going to need to be paid back by young Australians in the future. The second key issue here is to do with taxes. Again, taxes are expected to reach a record $470 billion by this financial year, which is 24.9% of GDP, and that's notwithstanding the very timid and limited proposed income tax cuts that the government has put forward. And the third key issue here is spending. Now, spending is just increasing year on year to reach a record $480 billion. Now, the reason why spending is so important is because more spending is the cause of higher taxes. And if you want to deliver permanent and sustainable reductions to taxes, then there needs to be permanent and sustainable reductions to spending. Yet what we see in this budget is rapid increases to education, to welfare and to health expenditure, which is driving up the total spending bill and ensuring that taxes and debt is going to stay high in the future.
It seems like, to me, one of the really interesting things is that in the lead up to this year's budget, Scott Morrison and other members of the government were talking about the importance of tax cuts, and they were talking about how significant those tax cuts might be. Now, over the weekend, Scott Morrison talked about the fact that those tax cuts wouldn't be mammoth. I wrote in the Herald Sun today that probably meant that they'd be more mouse than mammoth, and indeed it looks as though really what is happening with taxes is tinkering with the brackets, tinkering with the rates of tax. And really some of this is to do with dealing with bracket creep. Now, it doesn't deal with bracket creep in the way that bracket creep can only be dealt with, which is indexing rates against inflation. But of course, one of the most significant things in this is the tiered process or the staged process in which these tax cuts are being phased in over the next 7 years. The Treasurer talked today about a 7-year tax plan. That means in 2024, income tax rates for those on higher incomes are going to come into play, whereas those on lower incomes are going to start from the 1st of July 2018. Do we think that there's any likelihood that in fact this 7-year tax plan is going to be implemented, or do we think that this is wishful thinking?
I think where we're headed is the same path as what happened with the proposed business tax cuts that they put forward last year, which, if you remember, that was to reduce the corporate tax rate for all businesses down to 25%. Now, that was a very unambitious target to start with, and they had to barter down with the centre from there. And I suspect we'll see something very similar, where they're starting with a very modest proposal, and the most substantial component of that modest proposal isn't due to come in for another few years. And so my concern with this is that you'll get the tinkering components and the temporary fixes to things like bracket creep, but we're not going to be getting the deep structural reform that is needed in the income tax system. And I believe what they should be looking at is much bolder, more radical reform, such as moving towards a much flatter tax system, a single income tax rate, reducing thresholds, things like this would be a better way to go, and then to take that to the Senate and to barter from there. But again, they're starting from a weak position, and I'm not convinced that it's going to do very much economically or for Australian workers or families.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And one of the really interesting things about the tax plan in particular is that we're increasing the level at which we're gradating taxes. So the top rate at 45% is going to remain the same at least until 2020. Well, I mean, under this plan, it doesn't move. But one of the really interesting things is the second bracket down at the 37% rate will be abolished, or at least that's the plan that the government's put forward tonight. I think the fascinating thing about that is it means that, and they're slightly increasing the threshold from $180,000 to $200,000. What that means is that in 2024, if this tax plan is put in place, if your salary increases, you get a pay rise from $199,000 to $200,000, your marginal tax rate increases from 32 to a whopping 45%. I think that's quite extraordinary that there's this huge jump now from the 32% rate right up to the 45% rate.
Yeah, and that will discourage upward economic mobility, and it's going to discourage people going from upper middle incomes to higher incomes, and that's a serious concern to do with that. And that was some of the mood in the room and in the budget. Talking to some of the other analysts and economists in there was that it was a bit of a surprise move to have that massive leap that would take place there. Now, what the government's selling that as is it's going to provide tax relief for middle income earners, and that's true. It will mean that there'll be a decent number of people that will be on a lower tax rate, or their top marginal tax rate will be lower than would otherwise be the case. That's clearly a benefit to those individuals, but the concern here is for what incentives people have to move up the income scale and to succeed and prosper. And I think there's a fairly widespread concern about the negative implications that you just raised.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the interesting things that was talked about by the Treasurer tonight in his speech is that 94% of working Australians will have their taxes decreased. The issue, of course, is that those at the upper end are those that are paying the majority of income taxes at the moment, and that probably won't change. We're still going to see a very large proportion of taxes that are paid by those on the upper end of the scale, contributing much more significantly to government coffers than those on middle or lower incomes. One of the other things I just quickly wanted to touch on before we go tonight, Dan, is this idea of debt. Now, you and I are relatively young people, and it's probably likely that down the track the significance of that debt bomb is going to be something that we are going to have to diffuse, and we're going to have to do that through increasing taxes down the track. How significant a risk do you think that is, and is there much hope, do you think, for getting rid of the debt, given that the surplus we saw, or at least the first announced surplus that we saw in 2020 is as small as less than 0.5% of the budget total, I think, at $2.2 billion?
Yeah, and even that's based on highly optimistic assumptions that I think, the consensus of economists in the room was that that's unlikely to be realised. And in terms of the specific issue of debt, I mean, it's one of the less talked about, but I think the most important issues in Australian economy and Australian young people today, because it is going to be young people that pay back all of that debt. And that's ultimately going to come through higher taxes, most likely higher income taxes. That's going to discourage work, it's going to discourage businesses, it's going to discourage people coming into the workforce. And this is a fairly serious issue when you look at there's over 700,000 Australians that are already out of work, and just raising the debt without actually addressing spending is going to make that situation worse. And this discussion gets back to the fundamental issue that we talk about day in, day out of the IPA, which is the need to rationalise and reduce the role of the Commonwealth government in people's lives. Realistically speaking, if we're not going to be looking at how we're going to change education or health or welfare spending, then there's simply no way that debt is going to come down without higher future taxes. So that conversation about cutting spending rather than just reducing the growth hasn't been had, and that's a big concern.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Look, Dan, thank you very much, and thank you to all of our audience out there who have tuned in tonight. This is obviously going out live, but the recording of the video will be up on our Facebook page, and we'll also be putting it up on YouTube. Thanks again for tuning in, and thanks so much, Dan, for doing the hard yards in the budget lockup today. It's been wonderful to get your views and your analysis on the budget. So thanks very much for joining us, Dan Wild, Research Fellow here at the Institute of Public Affairs.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.